There is a standing contingency plan for counter-terrorist operations. That's a thing called op tempora, when in real extremis you could have 3,800 people who were given to the police at times of either high threat or when critical national infrastructure needs protecting.
Major General Chip Chapman is a former head of counter-terrorism and UK operations for the MOD. Morning, Chip.
Good morning, Steve.
This is really interesting because the army's now on standby because of some of these police people handing in their licensing. They're not going to shoot anymore. And it says in the Times today that soldiers are on standby to protect Britain from terrorist attacks. If the army have to come in to do that, will the level of protection be the same as if the police were doing it? Or are we losing something along the way?
Well, we would be losing something, but it doesn't necessarily mean it will be the army. And we'd be losing something because very few people in the army are warranted. Only the police are warranted, and a small number of people in the armed forces or the MOD police. And one of the things which could be used, because the military aid to the civil authority request is to the MOD, is that you could use the MOD police, not the army. They are warranted, and they are also a specialist police force, and they are armed. So that would make sense. Now, there is a standing contingency plan for counter-terrorist operations. That's a thing called op tempora, when in real extremis you could have 3,800 people who were given to the police at times of either high threat or when critical national infrastructure needs protecting. And we did that in 2017 following the Manchester attacks and the Parsons Green attacks. So there is an established plan that is largely, though, to do with substitution to free police officers. It is not to do with the army being used in a routine policing capacity, because as I've really said, the army or any of the armed forces don't have any powers greater than an ordinary citizen in terms of what they do when they're armed.
And for good reason, that isn't it? Because there's a sort of constitutional concern here, isn't there? That army people enter the chain of command for a civilian institution and then are asked to bear arms in that regard. It isn't as straightforward as you might first think.
Well, they always remain under military control, so they would not be under civilian control. So there's not a constitutional issue here. What is interesting, though, is, of course, with the experience that the army largely had in Northern Ireland, and this does relate to the case of November X-ray 121, the officer who was involved in this case. So there was a case of a soldier who, rather like November X-ray 121, put a number of shots through a windscreen of a car, which I think is what happened in this case. The first 4 shots were deemed to be legal, that is, proportionate and legitimate. The 5th was excessive force. And I think this is what we're really coming down to probably ultimately on this case. In that case, and I can say this because it was Northern Ireland, went to the PPS rather than the CPS. And of course, like all these things, the test for prosecution, be it a policeman, or a civilian, or a military person, is that it must pass the evidential test. That is, it's a reasonable prospect of conviction, different than what happens in court. And it must pass the public interest test. Yeah. That is what the CPS will have looked at. So largely, you have to sort of strip a lot of this emotion out of it to say that is the real test which the CPS will have used, nothing else.
And ultimately, that's going to carry on whatever the Home Secretary thinks or anyone else thinks. Just finally then, if this were to go on, if there were to be a considerable continued refusal of armed police to carry arms, is it sustainable for the military police, the MOD police, or the army to... I mean, how sustainable... the army is stretched in all sorts of directions. How sustainable would the situation be in your view?
Well, I think it would be sustainable. And you've got to realise, I think, also there was only, 100 people who've sort of downed firearms at the moment. There's something like 6,200 operationally deployable police officers. And at the moment, you're obviously using mutual aid from other Home Department police forces. So this is a contingency. It's not being enacted. It would be sustainable, depending on what that number is from the 6,192. Yeah.
That's really interesting. Chip Chapman, thank you for joining us. That's Major General Chip Chapman, former head of counter-terrorism and UK operations for the MOD, suggesting that actually this is something that can be managed at the moment.